This is definitely one of the bosses of all time. Hello, Dratty T. As a recent fan favorite of ranking the couple things, we made the worst raid of all time by, if you guys missed
Yeah.
it, we basically picked the worst boss in every spot in the raid and like made like what would actually be the worst raid ever. We also ranked the Vault of the Incarnates raid bosses like after the raid was over. So I thought this time it would be good to rate the new upcoming raid bosses, but before they come out, strictly based on the design and like how we saw the bosses in testing, and maybe if a lot of changes happened since testing, which is true of like 3 of them, then we can kind of mention those and just talk about how we think the fights will be. Obviously, one caveat here is Sarkareth has not been tested on any difficulty. It's obviously been heavily thought of and strategized by a lot of the top guilds. And you have a general idea of how the fight works. We'll probably just leave Sarkareth for the end and like talk about general ideas without going too in depth into it. But yeah, Dratnos, how are you? Are you happy to do this?
Oh yeah, dude. I love the new raid. I've done all the testing. I've read through all the dungeon journal. It looks like a sweet one too. I think we're gonna have some pretty high ratings at least. At least my half of these ratings is gonna be pulling them upwards, I think.
Okay, yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I actually listened to, so I actually pulled up for like interesting context. I have you like I'm gonna have like POVs of yours because I watched while I was working out. Actually, I watched every single one of over the past month or two your like opinions on the raid testing bosses because there aren't a lot of people actually doing that and putting out like thoughts on design of the bosses, and I mostly agree with them. So I think we're largely gonna agree on a lot of these fights, but I am definitely interested to hear what you think. And then for you guys, I want to kind of be able to talk about the boss while showing it a bit so you guys get a little bit of an idea of what these bosses look like. Have you made it? Did you do a Mythic Kazzara?
No, my internet was bad that day, so I don't have. That's
Okay.
the only one I don't have.
All right, cool. That's fine. Okay, so let's probably just start right off the bat. Typical tier rankings of DDDD, Don't Ask, is the top, and then Swamp Ass is at the very bottom, and then SA, B, and C in the middle of that. All right, and we can make new tiers if they're relevant. So let's talk about everyone's favorite topic, which is the first boss. Probably the boss that most people interact with throughout a raid is like the first one. It also is the first in the first 3 bosses. It's the only boss that drops very rare loot. It drops like basically this raid's icon, albeit a lot less powerful relatively than what icon was. Super basic fight. What is your opinion on Kazzara?
Yeah, I mean it's a first boss, right? Like it gets judged on kind of a different scale than an end boss would. It seems like it's not going to have any of the things that make first bosses suck, which is good, right? Like it's not
What
gonna
are
have,
those
like,
things, do you
really,
think?
like you think about like bosses like Vigilant Guardian or Hellfire Assault, where you're just kind of sitting there waiting for waves of mobs to spawn, and it gets worse and worse during farm as your gear gets better. It seems like here it's going to scale well with getting more powerful throughout the tier. It's probably going to be a reasonable, introduction to mythic rating and to heroic rating on the lower difficulties, right? For players stepping foot into the raid, kind of a good way to ramp up the difficulty and start off with something that's pretty simple, objectively speaking. It's got like kind of one important mechanic, right? Those rays that you have to just kite into the rifts, and on mythic there's like a little twist, right, where you need to not run it back over the old lines. And I don't know, besides that, you just you just kill the dragon, right, and do some raid healing, pretty light raid healing as well. I think I mean, I don't think it's like groundbreaking or anything. I don't think it's doing anything particularly innovative or exciting, but I don't think it has to, right? It's the first boss. It's probably going to be pretty good at that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I completely agree. Like, as people are watching it right now, basically, among other things, the only thing you do on this fight is you dodge a frontal, and then these rifts go on the ground, and you have to kite these beams into the rift to make them go away. There's a few other things that happen, but that's basically it. There's no damage stops. It's all single target, and the boss at certain health thresholds breaks its armor like Remnant of Ner'zhul and does like a little bit of raid damage. But like, as far as easy to understand, this is what you want. Like, no one's trying to think about how to do a first boss. That's totally not the point, which this boss accomplishes. There's no weird things about it. It's not like some crappy ad fight. I think this is like pretty much what you want. It doesn't ask a lot of the player. This is great. I think this is like, if you're ranking it with first bosses, I would go very high here, I think. I don't know if... Well, actually, okay, what would be high? What is your favorite first boss ever? Ever?
I actually liked Terragru because it was just kind of fun and cool, and they were doing a a quirk thing, but on a boss where it didn't matter and it didn't like make it suck. So I thought that did pretty well, but this is like a different kind of good, right? This is good in that it's just like nice, simple, right in the first room when you walk in, right? A little bit of trash, I guess, before you fight it, but still nice little intro to the raid. Yeah, I mean, I think you could put this in as basically as high of a tier you'd be willing to put a first boss in, which is probably like 1 or 2 below the top. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, first bosses, it's like, what are you trying to accomplish? Yeah, I think you're right. I would put, so you think it's a first boss? Okay, so I'm thinking it's like A, right? It's not top tier, it's not S, it's certainly not bad, because like, you know, there's levels of first bosses that are pretty insane when it gets to how bad they can possibly be. But I don't know, like, assuming this comes out the way it's intended, what bosses that exist would be significantly better than Kazzara? Because it's so hard to rank first bosses, because
I mean, like,
you're making the argument that the simpler it is, the better, and then it's like, okay, well, if it's, I don't know.
Yeah, like, if you're ranking it against other first bosses, I think it's probably just got to be, like, tied for first with a bunch of other ones that aren't very offensive. But on the other hand, you know, it's not why we play the game, right? Like, if every boss was a first boss, we wouldn't be raiding, right? Like, we raid for the other bosses. So
correct, yeah.
If we're making a tier list, right? Like, this is just like good filler, but it's not what we're here for.
Yeah, I'm thinking more. Are you thinking A? What are your
Sure, yeah, I think A makes a lot of sense for this. If you are like, I think there will be a lot of people who only engage with the first few bosses of this tier and will probably have a lot of fun with it, and so for them it might.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Like
I highly doubt anyone exits this season at whatever point they stop playing and they're like, you know what, Kazzara fucking sucked. I don't know. It's just like, it's just there. Like, how could you hate this boss? It's not going to be something you wipe to a lot. It'll be pretty, I mean, in my opinion, it'll be pretty free loot compared to like a lot of other first bosses that have existed. Like, I think the fact that Aranog had a DPS check in the intermission to kill those little flame guys alone was just harder than everything Kazzara will be, which is fine. Yeah, I think it would, to be S or DDDD as a first boss, it would definitely need to be like visually spectacular or like a really cool, like, to go along with it being simple, and it's just kind of whatever. I will say though, and this is kind of a general theme in the raid, the whole idea of Shadow Flame looks sick.
Yeah, they have that aesthetic, and it's on like most of the fights, and it's good that it's on most of the fights because it just looks beautiful every time. It's gonna be
surprisingly
really, nice
really fucking cool. Yeah. Okay, all right, so let's move on. So let's do the left wing first. So for people who are unfamiliar with this raid's layout, basically there is the first boss, and then you can go left and kill 2 bosses, which are both linear, or right and go 2 bosses, which are both linear. So technically Zaqali Assault and the Amalgamation Chamber are both technically, like, could be the second boss, and then they each have a boss after them that's like the wing end boss. Now these are not the wing end bosses this time around. Rashok and Forgotten Experiments are not intended to be like Halandris or even Dathia or Kurog like you saw in Vault. That eye level increase actually happens on the boss after those 2 little wings, so on like Zskarn and Magmorax before Neltharion. So I don't anticipate, just to give you an idea of difficulty and like what we're attempting to expect. So let's look at Amalgamation Chamber. So just to give you guys a little bit of a visual, it's kind of like a little bit like Eye of the Jailer in Sanctum, where like you have these, remember the intermission phase where you had, you know, half the raid had each stack. That's available from the very beginning of the fight. After you get these to 50%, it merges into one mob, and then you just fight a variety of Shadow Flame mechanics, and those buffs come back to play. Also on this fight, you are intended to like run into someone with the opposite buff to like clear your debuffs, and then it gives you another one. But it's obviously an easy second boss, but what are second bosses supposed to be? Kind of like the first boss thing, you know, they're certainly not supposed to be super challenging. What's your opinion here?
Yeah, I had a lot of fun doing this one as well. Like, yeah, you're not gonna, like, it has those mechanics that you could see if it was an end boss. You know, like when you clear with somebody is the opposite color as you get like a little dot for a little while, and it's pretty survivable. And you could definitely imagine, okay, if they had a similar fight like this later in the raid, that would be something that was really important to like plan out precisely. But you could kind of just YOLO it a little bit, and it was at least fine in testing, and I assume it'll probably be fine when it comes out live as well, because it is the second boss, right? That being said, I think mechanically it's pretty interesting for a second boss. It's got, you know, you've got the shadow mechanics and the flame mechanics, and then when you push to 50%, basically the new mob does a bunch of mechanics that do 1 shadow plus 1 flame mechanic, and so I think like,
yeah, like combines them
design wise. That's kind of interesting. Yeah,
like in the first phase you guys saw on the shadow side, it makes you like spread out with these pools, and on the fire side it shoots tornadoes, and then it goes into the second phase and it's going to do both, right? So these people all just got a little thing to fall off, and then afterwards it shoots tornadoes out in every direction, just like something you have to dodge, and it creates area denial. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's nifty conceptually. It was fun to play. Nothing seemed too hostile about it. So this is a boss that I'm probably going to look forward to killing every week, I think.
Yeah, same. I'm trying to compare it to like other bosses that you could compare it to. I guess maybe the better comps are like, I mean, Eye of the Jailer is the easiest comp for sure. Then you have, some older ones like Huntsman. It's a little different than Huntsman, probably similar difficulty, I think. This boss is clearly not intended to be super challenging, but it looks sick. It's not bullshit to do. It's not bullshit to play. Maybe there's some issue with like GUID picking stuff and like the same people get the same mechanics, but like it's the second boss, man. Like I don't feel strongly positively or negatively about this fight. I feel like it kind of exists like Kazzara, but I also, if you're making the same argument, I don't think people are going to end this tier and be like, you know what? Amalgamation Chamber fucking stinks. I just don't think anyone's going to say that.
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit more excited to play this one than I am Kazzara. Like, from testing, I had a lot of fun on this fight, actually, so I would want to go, but I would still just want to say, I think, A for it. And
yeah, I just feel like it's not...
for the later ones,
yeah. No very rare loot this time for you guys who are used to doing the, like, 1-2 boss, Primal Council, Aranog, 2 very rare things in your vault. That is pretty much bricked this raid, unless you go up from Kazzara all the way to Rashok for the 3 boss vault, and then you have 2 very rare items, but that very rare item stinks. So it's like, it's pretty much only like you're gonna do the first 3 for people who are just looking for like a 2 box at a mythic. What was I gonna say about Amalgamation Chamber as far as it sucking or not? I think this might actually be hard to pug.
Also, if you want to pug for vault, you have to do 3 bosses this tier, which I think is going to be a lot harder than doing the 2 was in vault. Yeah, because you have to kill like this boss and another one, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's going to take a while before pugs are able to start doing that with any reliability.
Yeah, I don't know about tuning for both Assault of the Zaqali or Amalgamation Chamber. I think there are more than a few mechanics on that fight that actually make you have to know really what's going on, like clearing your debuffs on Amalgamation Chamber, and then Assault of the Zaqali, just kind of the whole fight, throwing rocks, making sure you like know which ads are important or whatever. I think Amalgamation Chamber is good. Like, think about the alternative, right? Like, we would get another prototype Pantheon-esque boss for the 3rd raid in a row, which those always suck. But on Primal Council, you didn't really need to know how to do that fight. Like you can kind of just pull it and it dies. I don't think either of the second bosses in this raid are like that. So maybe people will dislike them because of it, but I agree with you. I don't think it's S. I don't think it's B. I would say in general it's A. It's pretty good.
Yeah, which I think, by the way, like for a 2-target encounter like this, A is probably pretty good because a lot of those a lot of the like 2 to 4 target fights end up being kind of bad. So, but this one I'm not very worried about. It seems fun.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're going to do the wing end boss of this now, the Forgotten Experiment. I'm just going to let you cook here. What do you think about this fight?
All right, so there's a little weirdness going on with this one because it's this interesting fight where on Heroic, you kill boss 1 and then boss 2 jumps down, and you kill boss 2 and boss 3 jumps down, and then you kill boss 3 and you get your loot, right? On Mythic, once boss 1 gets to 50%, boss 2 spawns. Once boss 2 gets to 50%, boss 3 spawns. And each of boss 1 and boss 2 have kind of persistent mechanics that last for the rest of the fight. Boss 1 will put these bleeds out with each of its kind of Sire Denathrius.
Yeah, just like Remornia. Yeah, you just saw him.
Yeah, exactly. Which that puts that's sort of a persistent effect that makes you want to kill boss 1 as fast as possible, or play 1 or more evokers that can just clear all those bleeds, or play dwarves, which can clear all those bleeds. And then boss 2 starts putting out these debuffs. And the debuff kind of has this effect where it ramps up in intensity, and when you dispel it, it just jumps to a new person and puts down an ad that you have to then kill. So the longer you leave boss 2 alive, the more of those debuffs are kind of jumping around and the more of those ads are spawning. And then boss 3 has, some nasty stuff going on for it as well. It's spawning these temporal anomalies that chase after it and try and heal it or put a shield on it, right? And so the more of those you have, the more kind of soccer you're playing to keep that away from them. And on Mythic, it's you can't like kick it multiple times in a row without taking increased damage as well. So you're kind of juggling increasing amounts of mechanics. You have this slightly interesting decision of like, do we want to try and nuke down boss 1, or do we want to get boss 1 to 50% and then hit Lust and nuke down boss 2? What do we evaluate to be the most difficult part of this fight? It's an interesting question that I haven't solved yet for like my purposes, and I'm sure that once you get to this boss later down the line, you'll have a pretty good idea of what you're supposed to do. But it is kind of an interesting thing to think about. The mechanics were a little bit. It felt kind of weird to play. Like I don't know. It didn't feel particularly satisfying because it just seemed like if you were to just ignore boss 1 and nuke down boss 2, like that feels so inefficient and wrong. So I'm not sure there's really going to be something there, but. Yeah, I don't know. It has an interesting tank mechanic as well. All of the bosses kind of put a dot on whoever they're attacking, and that dot is very lethal if you get too many stacks of it. The two tanks run into each other, and all their dots clear, but it explodes for raid damage. And if you do that,
yeah, the tank mechanic's cool.
Seconds,
it's actually one of the rare
really cool.
scenarios where they make a very unique tank mechanic where they haven't done something like that before. And just as he's talking about that, and you kind of see it, I would say I agree in that the first two bosses feel like they make sense in the fight. And then you get to the third boss, and it was like they got really creative, and they're like, oh, it's an evoker. Like, this is an evoker testing facility, right? That's the whole bit of this fight is like, before they came up with the Drakthir as creations, these were like the ones that were the prototypes that fucked up before they got there. So they all have like weirdly different shit. And then you see the last one mostly resembles an evoker. So they have this guy deep breathing across the room. I think it's going to depend on how it goes live, because currently, I don't know if you guys are running into this, but the way to knock back these balls is super unintuitive, and it has like some weird global cooldown thing of it being able to be knocked. So if you're ever trying to chain knock it, it will like knock in front of you and like around. It was not easy to handle, and that was like really annoying to deal with. You can certainly make strats to go around that and stuff, but yeah, when I saw this fight, it seemed to me like Blizzard loves making council fights and raids. And this seemed like the council fight. This is the fight they're going to make council, but they were just like, you know what? We've done the like AoEing 3 to 4 targets of bosses as the early council fight for like 2 raids in a row. So let's just like swap it up a little bit. And then they just changed it to where you're just fighting them one at a time. But it does kind of feel like there's not quite enough going on to like really make up for that. And then it kind of comes down to where its places in the raid too. We're going to talk about Rashok pretty soon after this, which is the wing end boss of the right side. That boss is, number 1, a banger. We'll get to that. Number 2, it's significantly more difficult than this fight. Significantly. And it seems like those two difficulties are supposed to line up. So I think this boss might, have like either a ton of health or be super difficult in progression, or, have something else to it. But it definitely doesn't seem, when we tested it, it didn't seem fully complete. Like, it was doable. Nothing about it was wrong. It just seemed like it was missing something. And that's kind of how I would describe it. It just feels like you could be probably fighting all 3 of these at a time with minor changes, but they made you fight them one at a time. And it seems like if you were to fight Primal Council one boss at a time instead of all of them at once, that's kind of what this boss feels like.
Yeah, I think conceptually the like dropping down at 50% thing is interesting, but I agree. It just does kind of feel weird.
Yeah.
Or like something about it is just a little different than you'd kind of expect. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's a good chance that like tuning could be an important part of this fight, but I also agree with you that if they tune this to be hard by like making the numbers nasty, I think it'll be a pretty unsatisfying fight to progress.
Correct.
So
Yeah.
I think probably B is maybe
yeah, I'm definitely not thinking it's where this here. From where it is in the raid, I would definitely put it less than the other two. I wouldn't say it's like really, really bad. I think the whole like you have to make a decision of Lust is the major one, right? Like people would think normally you pull a boss and Lust on the pull. Well, it's probably not surprising to you to learn that like lusting on the pull might not be the best thing here, because the fight was really only difficult when you were fighting 2 bosses at a time. Not to mention you gain a lot of extra damage when you are lusting with 2 targets out. So lusting on pull with all your CDs is like probably not optimal. So you're having a scenario where you have to kind of figure out which bosses and which mechanics you want to deal more or less of. And I think that idea in general is great. Pretty much anytime they give you that option on bosses truly, it's actually really, really nice. See, right there, you tried to knock it backwards.
Yeah.
And you run into it, and this thing goes forwards. Like that. And
that's something that I kind of think is like a PTR, hopefully.
Yeah,
thing,
hopefully.
Right? Like, hopefully that gets fixed.
Yeah. So I think overall to be good, I will say the boss does kind of just spam deep breath at the end, which is easy, but also like you're just kind of doing nothing. But yeah, I without talking about Forgotten Experiments for too much longer, I think definitely, I don't think this boss stinks, but I also don't think that it's very good. So I think right under A certainly sounds about right.
All right, let's go to the
other side
of the Crucible.
Okay, so the potential second boss and the first boss of the right side wing of this raid, Zaqali Assault. This is definitely one of the bosses of all time.
Dude, it's, you know, every raid just has these like mindless ad spam fights, and every raid has like this like extra action button gimmick fight, and here in Aberrus it's the same fight. It's Zaqali Assault.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
Let's just say the expectations are low for this fight. So if it ends up not being awful, I think people are going to be pretty happy with it. And I kind of think it's maybe not going to end up being that bad. It was definitely the one where like during testing, everybody was tweeting about just how miserable it was, and I think it's likely to be the worst fight of the raid. But
yeah,
you know.
So for people to kind of understand what you're looking at is you're fighting this main boss, and you basically, the idea is you split up your raid half and half is the like the conventional idea of how you would solve this fight, and you would deal with these ads that are climbing up the walls. You guys just saw that one jump off the wall. Every time the boss is on your platform, he spawns rocks, and everyone in your group can pick up one of those rocks, and it gives you an extra action button, and you can look at the sides of the arena, and you can use to throw that rock to make the ad climbing up fall off the wall, and you don't have to deal with them. So one actual design element of this fight that's really cool is you can pick a certain ad besides the Mystic that sucks, and you can kind of just make sure you always get rid of it, assuming the spawns are always the same, right? So that part of it is actually cool. It does require moving and actually going over to the edge. But yeah, I think in general, this is fine. My main criticism here is the mythic mechanic of this fight just seems so irrelevant. Like basically the mythic mechanic of this fight is the Sun King Phoenixes and also like kind of a little knockback, but it just seems like it's so weird. Like it just could be there or not be there, and it just wouldn't affect the fight at all.
I think fundamentally as well, like this awkward extra action button to remove ads on an AoE ad fight. Like AoE ad fights are, the fun part is when you're just like AoEing stuff, but then just like removing mobs so you have less to AoE and hit, and like having to like go and awkwardly try and find where it is and use your extra action button, I don't think is going to be a particularly fun job either. So
yeah, I will say one shout out to Blizzard though. I am constantly of the opinion, and we talked about this when raiding the vault bosses, that the like meme ad AoE fights, if you're going to do them, which they are, having them be as early and insignificant as possible, in my opinion, is always a huge plus. Like for example, Broodkeeper as a second boss would have been much better than Broodkeeper as the second to last boss, and allowing a boss with better design elements to kind of shine in that space. Not to imply that Broodkeeper is bad, but Broodkeeper and Stone Legion Generals and Kel'Thuzad, those kind of fights ceiling is lower than or close to the floor of what some other second to last bosses can be just design wise. So I'm totally okay with this being early. That being said, having to rate it for its spot, I think as long as this isn't hard, I think if this fight is tuned to be hard for people who really want to get a 3-box, I think people are going to hate this fight. You know what I mean? Like if you keep wiping to this fight, it's just going to be so frustrating.
It's kind of like Primal Council, right? Like Primal Council was fine because it wasn't hard, but if Primal Council had been like half the time a pug kills Aranog, they can't kill Primal Council, that would have been really unsatisfying.
Yeah. So it's kind of hard to rate because I feel like this could swing like 3 letter grades based on tuning. And just to be clear, all of these things could swing based on like I'm serious, especially as we get later in the raid. Zskarn or something could be like an S tier, and then like they tune one specific part of the fight to be like, let's just make this up. Let's say they make the golems on Zskarn increase their health by 300%, and then Zskarn, while its skeleton of a fight is awesome, if they tune it to where you're actually just single targeting golems the whole fight or something, then like that's fucking sucks. Like, and that would just not be fun. So like they can change one thing and it could make bosses worse to all of them, but I doubt that you'd be able to make the argument that Zaqali Assault is better than a B, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think B is the ceiling.
Correct.
My guess is it probably lands around C. I don't think it's super likely to fall much lower than that, but it could. But since it's so early, I think it is unlikely they're going to make it, Stone Legion General's level of difficulty, which is when this sort of fight starts to feel really bad.
Correct, yeah. I'm trying to think, where are there early ad AoE fights in raids, and I'm trying to think how they're historically received. There hasn't really been any in a while. Like, Primal Council is not... This Council fight and Zaqali Assault, very different, even though they both have ads.
Like Vigilant Guardian.
Yeah, it is kind of like Vigilant Guardian or Hellfire Assault, but just the second or third boss instead of the first. And those are not historically well received.
Right, yeah.
So, maybe, ENR... But ENR was a little later in the raid. It was like 4 or 5. But I don't think people necessarily really fuck with ENR, so... I don't know. I think C is fine. It's hard to call anything swamp ass unless it has glaring problems.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a chance this will end up feeling pretty low if it is like just super buggy or
it's potentially swamp ass for sure.
But I think as I'm actually somewhat optimistic that it's gonna at least get to the C, which is,
I mean, I think it actually performed like that a little on testing. Like you noticed when they tested this on Mythic that it had, I think did they test it 2 times on Mythic?
They did.
Yeah, the second time, the stones felt more relevant because there was like clear burst phases. Like, you know, like you had 5 rocks up, but then like a bunch of wall climbers would spawn. You probably don't want to slam like rocks on wall climbers, right? Like they don't have as much health. You're basically choosing what's better to get rid of, a hunter or a guard or like a wall climber. Like it's no question, right? Like the wall climber is not on that tier. So like it does require you to kind of make decisions. I will say one annoying part about making those decisions though is you have to actually walk over to the edge and look down to see what you are throwing a rock at least as when you first pull it, versus like having some kind of indicator maybe above it. So that's maybe a little annoying, but I do like that it seems like there are intended times on both sides to use the rock, and it's not necessarily when you first get it, which is like a little bit of thinking, right? But yeah, I don't know. Let's leave it here.
I think that kind of thinking, if it's like something you can do intuitively on a fight, is fun. But I agree that if it involves running and like turning your camera, reading the text over a mob's head 30 yards below you, I think that's not going to be super fun, especially for like an early boss where there's maybe only 10 pulls. Like, I don't know, are you going to feel good about having like learned that boss in that time? Because it's so short. But maybe, I mean, I agree that it's like interesting conceptually. Yeah.
All right. Moving on to Big Boy Rashok. I think this fight is absolutely fucking incredible. So one thing people will notice from this raid is they did take like fight design skeletons from a few previous fights in this raid. So number 1 is Rashok. So this fight is in every way Guardian of the First Ones from Sanctum. Guardian of the First Ones was a fight that succeeded Sludge Fist and seemed like, oh, they're just going to make single target burns in every raid now near the end of the raid. That's really cool. Sludge Fist was one of the best bosses ever. So like that's going to be the thing. And then Guardian ended up being a huge flop. Like the design elements that made that boss good, they really, really screwed it up on release, and it also was tuned to be super easy. So very clearly they took the idea here from Guardian. The conduit in the middle is the same thing as the battery. And the searing slams are like the soaks. That they have an actual charge smash soak where you take the things into the middle. They made it unable to be tank soloed, and like there's individual responsibilities / like groups of people that will like clear their debuffs at any given time. There's like a healing absorb. It looks fucking awesome. I made my thoughts on this fight pretty well known. I like tweeted like during this testing, I think this is one of the best fights they've made in years by design. I think this boss is incredible. I'm not sure what you think.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think it's visually stunning as well on top of all that, and the mechanics they seem like that kind of great Sludge Fist mix of brief, intense decision making, but mostly just like throughput, which that combination is really, really fun. I will say, as a word of caution, a lot of us thought the same thing about Guardian of the First Ones before it came out, right? Like, I remember when we were progging Painsmith or whatever, or when World First Guilds, when you guys were progging Painsmith, we were like, oh my god, this raid is just going to be so good, because after this, there's Guardian of the First Ones, and that's going to be Sludge Fist too, right? And then that fight, it turns out that tuning is like really important for this sort of fight. So especially with the positioning in the raid of Rashok, I'm a little bit worried that it may end up not living up to its potential based on how it is tuned. But I think that, yeah, just the recipe is all there, right? The ingredients are all there for this to be an all-time banger. And if anything, I'm sad that it's so early in the raid, because I feel like if this was the second to last boss or the third to last boss or something like that, I would be even more excited about how great it was going to be.
I would kill for Magmorax and Rashok to change positions in the raid.
Yeah,
this is just a in every way superior version to what Magmorax is supposed to be. And I do echo those same concerns where if you have a boss like this early in the raid, you have to think about how Blizzard tunes the race, right? This boss drops lower eye level than Magmorax, and it's 2 bosses before Magmorax as a wing end boss, the same level of Forgotten Experiments. It's going to be hard for them to tune Rashok to have some super epic kill like Sludge Fist did, where like you're killing it as it's running into the wall at the end, right? Which would be killing this boss in its enrage sequence. And even before the enrage sequence, this boss gets way harder because the conduit's gone, so you can no longer clear these stacks. You have to like heal these huge dots. And that if it's going to be impossibly hard for Blizzard to tune that to have some epic, really cool first kill, and then also have Magmorax not be impossible, right? So, because we're going to have roughly the same eye level for both, right? So I imagine that this boss might get crammed, which would feel sad, but I don't think that's going to be how most people interact with this fight, right? Like, if we cram this fight, I still think people, especially early in the first couple weeks, will have like a really good interaction with this fight because it's just fun to do. Really punishing. If you basically get hit ever by any of these fire things, you die. If you have Searing Slam later in the fight starts ramping out of control, it is an absolute fucking banger. If we're just basing this off design, I put this as high as it could possibly be and looks, but I don't know how you feel.
Yeah, I'm down for the D tier, or I'd be down for S as well, just based off it not being super late into the raid and like that holding it back a little bit. But honestly, I'm just down for D.
Yeah, right? I know.
Like, it doesn't get much better than
I
this,
literally
right?
tweeted your exact sentiment of like, it's sad that it isn't later in the raid because it's so goated. But I don't think you can hold back like a boss because it's early, right? You do, like, if anything, it would almost prop it up because of how much better it is than most like fourth bosses, right? So yeah,
let's throw it at the top. That sounds right.
All right, slam it. All right, now we are through the 2 wings. The rest of the raid to attack Zskarn, the very next fight. You have to have both sides of the wings dead. So you have to kill Forgotten Experiments and you have to kill Rashok to attempt Zskarn. Both have to be dead. And then the rest of the raid is in a straight line. These are the bosses that are a little bit... There's a clear jump in difficulty after Rashok dies, especially mechanically. So let me get a good POV of this going. I think the common thing people have compared this boss to a little bit visually and kind of like fight length is like Painsmith, I think has been like a comp. It's like a mid-raid wall kind of, you know, very strategic fight. I fucking love this fight. The 1 hour we did of raid, it was one of the best raid testings we ever did as a guild. We just absolutely fucking smashed this boss in the first raid testing they did of this. But I feel like figuring this out and doing this was, in that 1 hour raid testing, was some of the most fun I've ever had. It felt like we were actually in progression. It was so fucking fun. I love this fight. Yeah,
I think, again, the ceiling is quite high for this, right? Like, this could well be a great fight. I'm a little bit concerned about the Sentinel. Like, so there's the 4 ads that spawn kind of all over the room, and then they go CC immune when they're below, like, 75% health. So I'm a little bit worried that that particular tuning knob could end up being something that is kind of not super fun to deal with, is, like, really having to hard swap and nuke them all down, like grip them together, AoE stun, nuke them all down, and get super punished if you fail to do that. If they have a lot of health. But aside from that, I mean, it seems like it's going to be one of those fights that has a good mixture of like a strategy and reacting to what happens during the pull, because, you know, there is a little element of things that you can't predict, right? There's randomly activated traps throughout the room that are going to make it slightly different from pull to pull. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, you can kind of orchestrate your entire movement through here, right? And you can plan exactly where you're going to be for most mechanics. So yeah, I mean, that does remind you of Painsmith. I'm pretty excited for this one too.
Yeah, and so just in general chat, so there is a little bit of randomness on this fight. Basically, whenever the boss casts traps, it puts 2 on the direct closest to things, then there are 2 that are random. However, when you kill these golems will give you an item to remove traps in the room, so you have a way to deal with the randomness. So it's not something that will wipe you. There will definitely be scenarios in the fight, though, where you get lucky. I doubt it'll ever be a scenario where it's like, oh, our pull got fucked because of RNG. It's way more likely that you're like, oh, this pull just feels easier than last pull because we got good RNG, which is kind of the good way to do it.
I am a little worried that, like, you're going to be ready to kill this boss, and then, like, you're going to start pulling it, and there's going to be one pull where it just doesn't put any traps in the middle of the room, and you're going to instantly kill the boss on that pull because it's going to feel so much easier. But, you know, I'm not super worried about that. It's something that could happen maybe.
I really like this. Also, they made it a lot better visually. The second time we tested it with the arrows. This is another boss, though. You're right. This is a potential DDDD, no question. This could be one of the best bosses to ever be in WoW, straight up. But it is also potentially bad. And also, this is another one where, like, it's kind of like what is the big, like, super complicated skill tree in PoE called?
Yeah, the passive tree.
Yeah, like, it's the passive tree, whatever it's called. Like, that thing is one that, like, most PoE players nut about. They're like, oh, dude, all the choices. But in reality, that is something that like 10 people interact with and everyone else kind of just like copies a build from someone, right? That is kind of how Zskarn is, and that's kind of how Lihivum was, where the first couple of guilds to kill this encounter, if they're progressing it at the same time, will have so much fun coming up with, or have already come up with, a great way to kind of position and play this fight. And everyone else, I don't think, will have the exact same opinion and feel of it, because it's just going to feel different copying someone else's routes on this boss than it will be coming up with them on your own. It's just one of those kind of fights where you lose a little bit by doing it after.
Yeah, I think Sire P2 was another good example of this, right? Where like you guys and Echo had, different strategies, and the process of developing that was probably really cool and interesting, but and then everybody else just kind of copies one of those two. And I do so as a guild that does the copying usually, the process of like figuring out why it's done that way and then copying it well and understanding the motivation behind all the movement, that is still rewarding on a good fight. Like on a fight like Sire, that still was fun. But I agree, it's a different thing than like during PTR when we're actually trying to think of it for ourselves.
Yeah. Also want to point out one thing before we rate this. I see a lot of people, I noticed like 4 or 5 people in chat mention melee. They're like Kek W melee. I do want to point out, not necessarily about this boss in specific, and not really commenting on the power level of any class in the game at the moment, but I will say that the amount of times in which the community says melee cannot be good for this, based on a PTR testing VOD of, very early attempts on something before there's like a really defined strategy, the amount of times people think melee is bad for absolutely no reason is very high. I just want to point that out. Not saying they're great at this fight, bad at this fight, whatever, just that almost every time someone states that confidently, they have no idea what they're talking about. So
I do agree that people say that every tier. I will also say that this tier, I think, is more likely than the average tier based on testing to end up being a nasty one for melee. But
okay.
It is the kind of thing where it's like one mechanic change, or also, like you said, like as you just get more comfortable with the fight, right? Like if we're moving the boss in such a way that's nasty for melee, maybe we don't have to do that, right? Like that could well be something that the actual strat is pretty easy for melee, and just we're just doing our first take at it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and obviously I won't comment on that, but I would say that if there are concerns, never mind. Okay, so that is Zskarn. I really want to rate this one on potential. Like, I think the difference between like rating Zskarn and Rashok both in the same tier is Rashok is way harder to fuck up than
right.
Way harder to fuck up than Zskarn. Zskarn could very easily, you tweak a couple knobs and this fight is not fun to play. Rashok is just kind of, it would be sensational if they fucked up Guardian twice. I don't know. Man, I don't know, but the potential is like so high. I need your help. I don't know. It has to be S or DDDD. I just don't. I think there's so many factors that swing this.
I mean, I'm an optimist. I'd be willing to go DDDD and be sad if I'm wrong later. Like
I agree.
This fight from testing, what more can you ask for? And I agree it's more likely to miss than Rashok, but, hope springs eternal.
Yeah, so I'll put it behind Rashok, but I am very, very excited about this fight. All right. Moving on, there are 2 more bosses that we have like VODs of that we can rank, and then we'll talk briefly about Sarkareth. On to Magmorax.
So this one's actually changed quite a bit since PTR testing.
Correct.
They've iterated on the kind of mechanics here several times. The basic idea is that you have these fire puddles that are spawned around the room that you're trying to shrink by standing in them and getting this fire dot. And it's kind of alternated between like the more dot you have, the less effective you are at soaking it, or like maybe you die at 20 stacks of the dot, but the dot falls off. And now it looks like, I think on the latest one that I saw, it's like, it's a permanent dot. And once you get 50, it kills you or something.
Yep.
We've tested, I think, on 2 of those different versions, but not the most recently put in the Dungeon Journal one. It was kind of an interesting fight. Yeah, it was kind of cool. Like it has that feel of a boss where you're going to kill it, when you're on like a tiny sliver of remaining safe space at the edge of the room. And it's going to feel like you're really up against the wall, and that's going to be kind of cool. There was during testing this kind of awful RNG puddle spawning where puddles could spawn.
Oh yeah.
Either in the old puddles and be fine, or like in front of where you wanted to go and be awful. But it seems like that's also gone in the newest Dungeon Journal updates, and now it's just like soaks, like Armageddon soaks that need to be done. I'm reasonably optimistic about this one as well. I think it's going to be probably a little bit lower. It has this weird stomp mechanic as well that
massive knockback.
Yeah, it lines up with your gateway cooldown. So like, yeah, I guess you'll gateway it. But...
Yeah, see, I think that is a bit of a downside. So it does line up with gate every time, and I think people who play the game a lot, you guys have probably learned how to gateway knockbacks before, but having that be basically required, like at really like a minute or two into this fight, getting knocked back as far as you get knocked back is not an option. You are fucked, right? So you'll just soak a million stacks for no reason and just be way higher. Your whole rate will die if you do that. Kind of like building the fight to be gateway knocked intentionally is like definitely a choice. And it's especially because the knockback is so big. It is. I think it might be the biggest knockback I've ever done in a fight. Like you could probably get knocked back clear across the entire platform or most of it. That's one thing. You mentioned, so this boss has big Halandris vibes in a way. And what I mean by that is Halandris, if people remember when it was tested, it was nothing like how it was on release. It had Odin runes on it. It was just a completely different encounter. And we never tested it after that. It ended up being one of the best bosses ever. This boss, when we tested it, had RNG puddles. You guys know who we just talked about on Zskarn? How, like, there are RNG Dragonfire traps, but they give you an element of the fight to deal with it. This fight did not have the solution, but had the same problem. It had, every time the boss roared, it put down 2 random puddles in the room, and your pull from pull to pull could have been really, really easy or infinitely more difficult based on pure RNG, which is obviously terrible. They recently changed that, like you said, to just be an Armageddon soak during the roar, and has like a fire damage amp associated with it to incentivize you, like not soaking it multiple times in a row. So that's like kind of how the version of the Mythic fight is. I think when people saw this initially, they're like, oh, this is new Sludge Fist. A fight that was really easy to understand. Kill the boss before it kills you. You kill the boss before the whole platform is lava. But like it's fundamentally easy to understand how to do it. The first implementation of this and through all of Mythic testing was extremely convoluted, really complicated, really degenerate in how you would deal with it, actually, and how you would deal with it. But they have changed a ton of those things. I believe there are 3 first-time fight designers in this upcoming raid, 3 people who are making raid fights for the first time. To my knowledge, those people are making Amalgamation Chamber, Assault of the Zaqali, and Magmorax, which is obviously pretty late in the raid, but it has less... It's intended to have less mechanics than normal fights. It's a kill it before it kills you kind of thing. I still think, and maybe this will be different on live, one major knock to this fight that they have not solved yet is this fight, and I can pause it right now if anyone's watching the stream. It's really difficult visually. So let's say you want to soak the pool to help your team, right? Let's say you want to get like 8 or 9 stacks to reduce this fire. All right, you could stand in the fire where my mouse is right here, and you could soak 1 stack every second. And you could stand 3 feet next to that based on where previous pools are, and you will soak 30 stacks a second and instantly die. And there is 0 ways visually to differentiate the two other than remembering where there are extra pools, and with everything else going on in the fight, highly unlikely that a lot of people will be able to do that. So they need to do that for sure. I think without that, this fight will be dreadful to progress and very random deaths to stuff like that. But I think that's the only real knock I have now. I would say this is a significantly worse designed fight than Rashok, in my opinion, because they're kind of both trying to accomplish the same thing. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think the knockback, like we were talking about earlier as well, seems like a kind of out of place mechanic for this encounter. And yeah, the visual clarity is, it's one color, right? It's a fight with a lot of important mechanics that are all orange. So that's gonna take a lot of mental bandwidth to kind of try and keep track of which one is which. And I think those definitely have to cost it a tier or 2. But otherwise, I mean, I do think it's very likely to be a really fun experience of killing this for the first time, right up against the edge of the room, a tiny little safe spot and just a whole room of fire and the boss, about to enrage.
Potential Sludge Fist kill hype levels. That does exist, and that's something you won't know until you kill it. Because like Sludge Fist, as great as a fight as it was, almost everyone who killed that boss, and this is really impressive they accomplished this, almost everyone who killed Sludge Fist for the first time killed it as it was charging at the end. Even throughout the entire patch. Like, whenever you killed it first, it was pretty close to killing it basically as you were dying, which was an awesome feeling. Now, if that was not true, if something very minorly changes about Sludge Fist to where Sludge Fist does not necessarily die like that for a lot of people, your opinion of the boss is totally different, right? These are very, very big swinging bosses. They either hit or they don't. Guardian and Sludge Fist might be the perfect example of that. So I think the potential's high. They also changed the frontal animation, which was basically impossible to see. recently, which is going to make the fight a little bit easier to progress as well.
Yeah, that one was kind of silly.
Definitely with the most recent changes, this fight became much easier to understand, where before it was extremely complicated for the average guild. So,
I'm kind of feeling an A. I don't know how you're feeling about this one.
if Rashok is DDDD, this thing cannot come within 2 ranks of Rashok. Like, Rashok is just so much better. Like, not to like criticize, like, I think they're maybe trying to do different things, but it just looks cooler. It is better. Like, honestly, Magmorax, like, while it is supposed to be simple, it also just like low-key looks like a classic boss. Like, I don't know, like it doesn't look awesome. I guess the arena you're fighting in is cool, and like when you guys enter the raid, the boss isn't attackable until you obviously kill Zskarn, but you can see him like swimming around in the lava. Like, that's kind of cool. Like, I don't know, it's like a little guard dog. Yeah, I'd go A. I think this boss is A on average, and it's potentially, with the changes, probably potentially B, worst case scenario C, and also potentially S. Highly doubt it makes DDDD. It just doesn't have enough to put it there.
Yeah, I agree.
So I'm going to say A, and that's optimistic, I think. Yeah. All right. Echo of Neltharion. How far did you guys get in your Neltharion test? How far of a POV do you get here? Do you see P2?
We saw, yeah, we were about to push into P3.
Oh, awesome. Really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, I can kind of just describe P3 for people just to give a general idea of how it looks once we actually get to that point. But what are your initial thoughts on Neltharion?
Yeah, so this is a cool encounter. It's also undergone some changes in PTR. It started with this kind of class call mechanic like Neltharion had back in Blackwing Lair. They had to scrap that, which kind of made sense because it was going to be kind of weird. We were thinking of like cutting down to like 4 classes to try and maximize, the number of people that would get affected by that if it mattered, which would have been a weird incentive. So basically, P1, you have these walls all over the place, and then you kind of break some walls, and 3 people get affected by this debuff where when it expires, anybody that is in line of sight of them gets hit. On PTR, it wasn't a one-shot, but it looks like they've updated some values now, and it will be. So you got to line that perfectly, basically. And you break open the walls in a couple different ways. The tank mechanics and all the phases break open walls, but also there's like the boss does these shadow charges at people that will break open the walls behind them whenever it doesn't bug out because they're already too close to the wall. And so you would kind of like plan out or figure out a way to open up so that you could have 3 different people line of sight your raid and each other at the same time, which is actually kind of cool. Line of sight is something that if you told me a fight has a line of sight mechanic, I'd be like, all right, -1.5 tiers. Yeah. But this one actually was pretty fun to play. Like it's not one of those like jailer line of sight mechanics where it's like, I'm trying to heal somebody, I can't. Like, this is misery.
Correct.
Instead, it actually was kind of a cool mechanic to play with. And then you're sort of moving around the room using the tank knockbacks to move into these new parts of the room, and it feels pretty dynamic. Then you enter P2, and you have some people get affected by this corruption, and they become hostile to everybody in a way where like you can hit them, but they're still in control of their character, and they've got to like break the shields on these ads. And you break those shields, you DPS the ad, and then everybody can DPS the ad once you do that. You got to kill all these ads, and you got to do that before the boss kills you. And if you do that, then you get into P3, which we weren't quite able to do during testing. And yes, do you want to say what P3 sort of is about?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on P1 and P2, but P3, basically you get the boss to 40% and you kill all 3 voices in the phase, and then basically the room remakes walls, and then the boss will just, make portals on the walls, as it says in the dungeon journal, and then each one of those portals will spawn ads from it, in which you will like AoE down. Eventually they just like gain power, so you have to kill them before they're too strong. And then those same portals, kind of very similar to like Rygalon, actually. You like, in Mythic, it's only 1 per portal, and like he casts something that will kill you if you're not in it, and you only have a certain amount of them in the room to live a certain amount of sets. And then you basically kill the boss from 40 to 0, and obviously, depending on how many total portals are in the room, you have that much time to kill it before he kills you. So that last phase is there isn't a lot going on in the last phase, actually. Like, this is a weird fight where I feel like the last phase is actually easier than a couple of the other phases. It feels like it might be missing something, but it's not like too far off. And I have one concern, and that is on Mythic, obviously, you can read in the dungeon journal that there are 20 portals to take in the last phase, every single cast of, I think it's Ebon Destruction, something like that. And if that means that 20 ads are spawning consistently, I do have some concerns of lag, Maybe not as much in 30-man raids, because Heroic, the portals work a little bit different than Mythic. There's not exactly 20 of them. But in Mythic, assuming there's 20 portals and there's 20 ads coming on the boss, that is, you know, everyone here did Denathrius, right? Like, sometimes you could just get instant servers where the lag is, like, pretty brutal. So depending on how they tune it to be, you know, 10 ads, 20 ads, whatever, maybe half of them spawn ads, could just be some potential of a problem. But that's like the general idea for P3, using, I think, basically all the information you could just obtain from the Dungeon Journal. So it's basically a 40-0 burn, Rygalon soaks, AoEing ads, and moving around the room to be closer to the portals where the walls are, is the idea. First of all, let's just kind of start with P1 of Neltharion, because I think this is a story. This fight can be told in like 3 different parts. P1 Neltharion and P2 are very similar in concept. Basically, there's just raid AoEs happening over a certain amount of time, and you have to kind of push the boss before those raid AoEs become too much. You guys can see him casting Echoing Fissure here. Let me turn the quality up. Sorry, I realize it's like super low. At a certain point in the fight, you know, every time a new one of those goes down, the other ones do damage to you. So it'll just become harder and harder to live that mechanic, which is very reminiscent of like kind of like Blackhand. I think this is like the Blackhand P1 is like the closest comparison, I think, to Neltharion P1. Not quite, but like in the way you play it. I think the Volcanic Heart mechanic is awesome. Also, side note, recent change. Blizzard made Volcanic Heart unable to be seen by add-ons, very similar to Forgotten Experiments charge mechanics. So you will not rely on a weak aura telling you to go left, middle, or right, or whatever, or at least conventionally. And you might have to do those by just YOLOing it and looking around you, which I think a lot of people prefer. But in general, I think the whole like knocking through walls thing is pretty cool. I like that element of the fight. Now, P2, like he mentioned, it has, you know, these like voices throughout the room. There's 3 voices. They have a shield that needs to be broken by people who are randomly picked by MCs. I think before even talking about anything else about P2, there's a big problem with this. So, so number 1, it's RNG. There are some classes in this game, not all. Some classes have damage all the time. And how fast you go in this phase is kind of determined by how fast you as a raid can kill these voices after they're broken, and how fast the MC targets can kill the shield. There are some classes who do all their damage in their cooldowns, and some classes who do, you know, they just do damage all the time, or they do 0 damage outside their cooldowns. You could get RNG'd based on picks, or people have to hold cooldowns. Both of them feel bad. Another issue, when you are sent down to the realm to break this voice from beyond's shield, you are hostile not only to everyone else in the raid, but you are also hostile to each other. So if you have 2 melees on the voice from beyond, you have to like aim your eye beams away from each other, and you have to not cleave each other. And I will say there are a few classes in the raid that have terrible interactions of this. So typically ones that spread dots to the entire raid when you get MC'd. And that's just like, I think basically there's a huge problem with fight design here, as far as I think they could accomplish the same thing of dealing with these voices without having players become hostile. I think there's way too much passive cleave in this game for that. You can certainly position around it, but it makes the fight less fun to play in general. So I've given them this feedback. I like highly feel like you should not be hostile with that mechanic, or else it's going to make certain classes unplayable, other classes better for some random niche fight reason, and it also just makes positioning really annoying. That's basically like my thoughts on the fight so far. I think P2 is a bit flawed in the way that mechanic works at the moment, but it could be fixed. I think P3 is not super epic, but kind of cool, and I think P1 is fucking awesome. That's my like full take on the fight currently by design.
I agree. Like the difference between somebody with damage and like passive defenses being targeted versus somebody who's like damage is down and who doesn't have a good way to like live the random starfall dot that's going to be on them or whatever is pretty bad for progression. Like you definitely, if this is like a 400 pull boss or something like that, or a 200 pull boss even, or 100 pull boss even, it's going to suck that just like half your pulls are going to feel pretty different based on who's targeted, and you may just not bring certain classes based on that.
Yeah, but I want to cut you off before we move on to the next thing. Specifically, that didn't like we did this boss and we went through P2 a lot in our testing. There wasn't a pull in P2 where like we felt like the pull was over because someone got picked. So like in a very anecdotal, not a huge sample size of doing this boss for an hour and being in at least P2 the whole time, it never felt like we got fucked. So it's possible that it's like not going to actually exist. The hostile thing's a huge problem. But the not having cooldowns up might not be big just based on that, just to give them a little credit.
Yeah, the shield breaking part is it's reasonably forgiving, and also you can send, in theory, the ahead to like help pre-break the next couple of shields on the first few, if you get lucky on your first one, and then you can get a little bit unlucky and still break the next few. So that part, yeah, I do think that the worst part is like also like just the positioning. You're just kind of like, okay, the people who get targeted have to run all the way over here, and like everybody else just make sure you're not aiming any kind of AoE over there, and like turn off your passive cleave or whatever, or don't play that spec, which that is kind of annoying, especially just because like if the person's just low and they can't get healed, right? So it's just going to depend, like, are they a warlock that's going to heal themselves, or are they a hunter who's just going to be like bleeding out until they get un-MC'd? That's I agree that it's not going to make a pull life or death, but it might well change the texture of some pulls in a way that feels kind of unsatisfying. I was going to quickly say the tank mechanic here is also pretty innovative in P2. It like separates your soul from your body, and then your soul can walk through walls. Your body can still get healed as well. A couple seconds later, he like baseball home runs your body into your soul. It breaks any walls that it crashes through, and it does damage to you based on how much health it had. So it does like execute damage if the soul was low. So it's
insane.
Neat mechanic.
It is. I have not played it, so I cannot give opinion on like how fun it is to play. But it is extremely unique tank mechanic, and it accomplishes everything you'd want. It's cool. It allows the tanks to have huge influence over the fight, which in raiding is not always true. And it just looks so like, dude, just imagine smashing your body into your soul and break any wall that's in between you. It's so fucking cool. Huge. I would have completely forgotten to mention that. That is very cool. I think people might not like this fight on progression because they might die. You can see it right now for people who are watching. Bam. They will. I think people are going to wipe to Volcanic Heart a lot. And so while something is good in that you can't make a weak aura to solve Volcanic Heart for you, it will have some negative consequences. Those consequences are, because weak auras cannot tell you have Volcanic Heart, which is why conventionally you would not be able to make a weak aura to deal with it. Neither can bigwigs, and neither can like a simple debuff weak aura. So if you guys are used to making debuffs right now on weak auras, like have a certain sound or whatever, that's typically done through weak auras or bigwigs or DBM. None of those add-ons will be able, right now, this as far as I believe, will be able to tell that you have that debuff. So you won't be able to get a sound for it. You're going to have to natty look at your debuff frames, which everyone can do. But some people, weak auras has kind of replaced their debuff frame, and because it's hard to blacklist it without add-ons and shit like that. So
my understanding is you can put like your protected debuffs in their own window and put them near the middle of your screen or something.
Something like that.
That might help, but my worry is that the way you're going to solve this is with a weak aura, that every time Volcanic Heart comes out, everybody who gets it is going to click that they got it, and then the weak aura is going to assign them. Depending on if they try and make it last slow enough for human reaction time to work, then maybe you just use your human reaction time to manually click a weak aura to tell you what's happening.
And I do want to do one quick shout out for the line of sight haters. While watching and figuring out this fight on testing, really loved the testing on this fight. I was like, you know what? For a line of sight boss, this doesn't seem that cringe. Volcanic Heart seems kind of fun to play. Everyone was doing it well. And then, obviously me not playing in that testing, like running it from the outside, my raiders instantly came back with, nah, this shit sucks. So just for people who are out there hating line of sight, you are not alone. It seems that there are a fair amount of people where basically line of sighting at all on raid bosses is just instantly, this is not very fun. So it's possible that removes the rank of the fight or lowers it depending on what class you play and how annoying that is for you.
Yeah, in my opinion, if this isn't fun, then they should never do line of sight mechanics again, because I think this is the most fun possible line of sight mechanic I've seen. Very good take. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. What are you thinking? I think this boss is wildly swinging. If they fix the MCs in P2 to not be hostile, which in my opinion is mandatory, they have to do that, without it being a massive issue. Not issue, but just really bad design in my opinion.
If they fix that, I think this boss could be as good as any other fight. I think this boss could be insane. I think the feeling of killing this at the end will have the same level of epicness of beating that last cast as beating Massive Bang on Rygolon. I think it could have the feeling of killing a Sludge Fist at the end of the fight while also having like really cool types of damage. It incentivizes 2-target cleave. The first phase is just, it's so perfect. It's like so perfect, the first phase for a fight. But at the same time, they don't fix that MC shit. And that's bad, then that's like brutal, you know, like I think this boss would be awful if it becomes that way because it just completely discludes certain specs or makes them significantly worse than others. And I just feel like fights should never really determine that, you know, outside of very minor, like, you know, damage type of things. I could see this boss being at the very top. I could see it being at the very bottom. I don't know if you can help guide me to somewhere.
Yeah, I would say let's tier this, assuming they're not going to change the MC to be not hostile, because it seems unlikely. I mean, obviously, I'm hoping that they will, but I think that can't be more than 50% to happen at this point. So let's assume they get almost all the other stuff right, but then it still has that kind of hostile MC. I feel like maybe B is appropriate. I would rather take A than C, I think, on that. But
I would rather take A than C. I'm okay with B. But yeah, this is, again, it's instantly A or S if the hostile thing has changed. And I think also, again, this is really hard to tell exactly how they will do it on live versus testing, but the amount of ads in the last phase could create an unenjoyable experience for everyone. But that is kind of yet to be seen, and I do not believe there's any public testing VODs of P3 Neltharion. So just have to leave it at that. Echo of Neltharion, I'm okay leaving it at B. I like that. That's fine.
Okay. Yeah.
And B again, with like a lot of upside.
A lot of upside, especially if they do just like send you downstairs instead of making you hostile when you get MC'd.
ID has public P3 VODs. When I looked at IDs, if that's true, we could definitely look at it on stream. That'd be good. When I saw ID's VODs, I saw their Bigwig save phase 3 as they wiped at the end of P2. There's like a little wipe mechanic at the end of P2 if you don't kill the third ad. But Bigwigs just says that if you ever wipe in P2 regardless. And I'm almost positive that they do not have public P3 VODs. Temerity versus normal Echo of Neltharion. Oh, yeah, actually.
You can see the normal.
Yeah, that's actually probably, let's see, Temerity. Oh, great. Okay. So 3 weeks ago, this is a public YouTube video. I'll just scroll to the end so you can kind of, okay, perfect. Okay, visuals will really help here. I should have gotten this beforehand. All right, so they finish off P2. They kill that last ad. They do have some people dead, but it doesn't matter. They make to the last phase, which spawns whenever you kill the last voice. Then you will see these walls. And the boss you'll see on one of his first casts, he will turn the Sunder Reality will turn some of these walls into little shadow portals. And those shadow portals will spawn ads from them. You'll see the ads kind of come out of them. And you will, at the end of this upcoming cast, does he cast it normal? I think he does. Let's see. Ebon Destruction, there it is. At the end of Ebon Destruction, this is the Rygolon, like, you die mechanic if you're not in a soak. And then you just have to soak one of these. And for every one you soak, it goes away. On Mythic, it's only one per portal. And that's the last phase. So it's like a just big blaster till the end of the fight. But on Mythic, you see it. How many? They're in like a 20-man, like an 18-man or something. How many portals will spawn here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Currently on Mythic, there's 20 soaks, right? That's in the Dungeon Journal. So there's twice as many ads, twice as many soaks, just to give you like a visual of like what the fight would look like. The portals do look sick, yeah. Okay, now Scale Commander. So I have been spending the last couple weeks like deep dive talking about Sarkareth all the time. Obviously, all of that is within our guild. So much of the Race World First exists on the last boss, so even though you don't see it on testing, you spend a ton of time thinking about it and how you would handle certain things. From your perspective, and I'll chime in wherever I can, what is your opinion on Sarkareth if you've spent some time looking at it?
Yeah, so I've read through the Dungeon Journal. It has some interesting sounding mechanics, but I haven't, spent a long time thinking about how they're going to actually, like, what the implications are going to be. One of the kind of through lines of the fight is you have this emptiness between stars mechanic, which basically, like, once you get 10 stacks of this Oblivion debuff, you get lost in the emptiness between the stars, and then you have 20 seconds to recover the fragments of your mind before you get lost there forever. But you can intentionally enter into the emptiness between the stars to like immune mechanics or to make mechanics explode and not hit the raid, that kind of stuff. So that's kind of a through line throughout the whole fight. Sort of reminds me of there have been a lot of fights like this in the past where you have to like take a bomb into a, like the jailer bomb, jump into a hole so it doesn't hit the raid type thing, right? Except in this case, it's like you have to manage these stacks of oblivion and time when you're getting to 10, so that you get sent into the vast infinity of space. Which I will say for flavor, like that's got to be a 10 out of 10. I don't know.
Oh, it's very, very sick, yeah. And it only applies in like P2 and P3, and that is something that, you know, is kind of an overarching fight mechanic. It's not really, but like think a Shara where like you had to get your stacks up to like 9 or 8 and then or 7, and then you would let those stacks fall off and someone else would rotate. You're definitely going to like have to send down people in groups. You definitely, the fight disincentivizes you from sending down too many people at once on Mythic to where you'd have to like constantly deal with that. But also as your stacks are getting higher, it's also a huge dot, right? Like imagine everyone in your raid has 8 stacks. Everyone in the raid would be taking 80k a second from Oblivion alone. And then the emptiness between the stars has multiple mechanics potentially where you take things down there to not hit other people. So like obviously in P2, to have the void bombs not hit the raid, you take it to blow up in the other phase. But also there's potentially other mechanics that, you know, can be taken down into that phase to be dealt with. So like your stack management is super important. And then you kind of skipped over P1, but I think P1 is really interesting. P1 is like really like Denathrius in a lot of ways, P1, except there's no ads. Like think of how you had 6 stacks and you had to go to 4. Or you had 6 stacks and you had to go to 2. Some classes could cheese it and have less. You could have 3 with druids. But P1 is like, you know, obviously there's area denial with the fire bombs, but basically in the time you have to do P1, you have to basically get all of your pressing howls to 0 before a glittering surge happens, or else you die. Except when you remove your stacks, it does raid damage instead of spawning a million ads. So it's Denathrius with, instead of moving for Ravage, you're moving because of Scorching Bombs, and to remove debuffs with a cleave and with another mechanic, it is, you know, it's kind of like that. So in my opinion, very, very similar to Denathrius.
Yeah, very evoker themed as well. It's like all these kind of evoker abilities that work differently, but you know, it's still evocative of that. The tank mechanic throughout the fight as well is kind of interesting to think about. So it slightly changes in the later phases, but it's basically always a physical hit up front that leaves behind a dot for either like 21 or 30 seconds or whatever, depending on the phase. And that dot does a bunch of magic damage to your tank over the duration. And in the later phases also reduces their healing received. And then when it expires, it releases a blast that hits your whole raid based on the damage taken from that tank dot. So I think this is going to be potentially, again, it depends a little bit on tuning. The numbers have changed in the Dungeon Journal, I believe, a few times now. But if this ends up being a significant amount of damage, this might well be one of the most restrictive mechanics in terms of which tanks you can play for the whole raid tier, because you want to gear up ones that will be good on this fight. Because some tanks have Ignore Pain that's going to be 50% effective, you know, 50% reduction of the damage just on all of these ticks, or they're paladins and they can stand in Consecration and reduce the damage that they take by a huge amount from all these ticks, or they're a bear and just have nothing and just are taking the full damage, right?
So
and,
that's something, so if people, like, you guys remember the Razagath beam in P3 where you, like, soak this beam and the amount of the damage you take hits the whole raid? That is how P3 of this boss is kind of designed right now. And, again, there is some potential stuff to where you don't deal with every Void Blast in some way or another. But in the scenario in which you do, tank balance at the moment...
it's some tanks can easily mitigate 80+% of this damage, and then bears can press one of their most precious defensive cooldowns to mitigate like a few ticks of it a little bit. It's crazy.
I mean, like on borderline on the level of like you would be unable to kill that boss in the first week with one tank versus another if all of these hit the raid.
And again, like maybe you could shift between the stars or something, the explosion. That's maybe that's how you're supposed to do it. Maybe that's how you end up doing it. Maybe it doesn't matter too much because it's not at damage at a time that other damage is hitting your raid. So maybe it can get healed up. But depending if that tank mechanic matters and if it matters how much you reduce it, unlike the Razagath beam, which was like a 4-second thing that you could kind of just throw a big defensive at, this one it's like a more than 20-second long dot, right? You've got to just kind of have passive mitigation against it that whole time or cycle a bunch of cooldowns.
Yeah, exactly. And there's basically a few mechanics where like you'll notice the Oblivion says in the space between the stars, or emptiness between the stars. Target is stranded alone in the vast infinite of space. So it's possible that there are multiple mechanics on this fight until seeing it where you could go down into that dimension, get to 10 stacks to have, certain mechanics on this fight potentially not hit the whole raid. And who knows how often you can do that? Who knows how worth it would be to do that constantly, right? And then there's also, if you guys played Remnant of Ner'zhul, this fight has Remnant of Ner'zhul knockbacks in Infinite Duress from P2 and P3, basically persisting the entire fight, 2 different players. That is, again, kind of the same thing, right?
Yeah. Again, we don't... the arena looked kind of small from, like, the trailer thing as well, so we'll see how that ends up playing out as well. How this ends up being fought. There's some other mechanics in this fight where Sarkareth's like deep breathing and summoning ads of itself that you gotta stop from doing stuff too. That a lot of words in the Dungeon Journal reading comprehension challenge, but it seems like that's gonna be like I'm curious of how much this is gonna be a single target fight versus like a quick target swap to those ads.
Yeah,
being something
it definitely changed really quickly because. And I actually interviewed Ian and Morgan. And in my interview, I mentioned, like, do you approach tuning differently in a patch where single target at the last 4 bosses of the raid is historically, like, at a high level where, like, there's really no scenario where you would play AoE talents. And then he was like, well, maybe we wouldn't fix that in class design, but maybe we would fix that in boss design. And then, like, it was like a hot fix, like, that day or, like that previous night or, like, the day after. And then they just added ads into the last phase where they previously didn't exist, which is like, the smaller ads that cast rescind and you just have to DPS it through this. Then like in Mythic, obviously there's like a bigger ad in P2 that spawns as well, with like a way to get rid of rescind through some other fight mechanic. So yeah, there's definitely a lot going on. And keep in mind, just to give you guys a visual, these void bombs are going off in P2 and P3. Scorching bombs are going off in P1, and they spawn, around players. And when they explode, they leave a hole in the ground that lasts for 3 minutes. So like, you're kind of going to have just area denial insane where you will literally fall through a hole and potentially have that be a huge issue, as well as every single time you go down, you will leave a hole in the ground. So lot of like precise positioning required on this fight, and then potentially really cool ways to deal with multiple mechanics. And I do believe it's possible that all of them are intended to do that, because none of them are intended, like, could wipe you. They're all livable damage, albeit high. So I think the purpose of this fight, and I think they're really smart in doing this, it's like anti-Anduin. What would be really lame is if you ever forgot to bring down an Infinite Duress, potentially, or a Void Bomb, or have a tank mechanic go off, if you just died every single time someone messed that up, you just guarantee raid wiped, right? That would feel awful. That would be why Anduin was really bad for a lot of lesser coordinated guilds, right? Where, the numbers on these are, even on Mythic, if one of them goes off, maybe you health pod and keep going. Like a bomb, for example. Like the damage on bombs, which is clearly intended to go off in the other phase, only 130k a second every 1 second. Or no, sorry, the blow up is 150k every 1 second for 4, right? People have 500k health this patch, DPS. So, like, that's doable, but obviously it's intended to not happen. So I like the way they designed that. And then another thing is, obviously you have no way to actually know this, but if you just look based on the phases compared to, like, other end bosses in the past, you'll notice that this fight has, like, less intermissions and less time. I think Blizzard is going for a shorter end boss than normal.
Yeah, like an 8-minute Blackhand type vibe.
Like a 9, yeah, something like sub 10 minutes is, I think, what they are going for a last boss. And I think the game is in desperate need of that. Just some historical knowledge. In the past, like, 5 to 6 years, there are 2 end bosses, 8 years. There are 2 end bosses total that clock in at sub 10 minutes, and it's Blackhand and Denathrius, 2 of the very best fights of all time. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think most of the time when fights go 12, 13, 14 minutes, there are some of them that are good, but in every single one of them, you could criticize at least one of the phases that had no business existing. It did not make the fight better by existing. It was just kind of there and just made... I would say in general, the thought is this. Fights should be very difficult, but there's a big difference in a fight being difficult because it is long in any way, and almost all the time having the fight be a little bit shorter or closer to that, like, 10-minute mark, but adding difficulty in other places besides the fact that you've been stressing your brain for 15 minutes. Those are always better designed fights. So if that ends up being the case, which obviously I won't know until we see it, that would be just very welcomed. I think the community and the game could definitely use another sub 10-minute end boss for sure. They're always fucking good.
Yeah, so I think at its best, this fight could very well be DDDD or even a tier above that, right? Like it could be the best boss of all time from what it says in the Dungeon Journal, or it could kind of stink. But there's a lot of encouraging things in there. Like you said, there's no phases that start with the word intermission. That's, I think, always a good sign for an end boss. The P1, you're fighting the boss right away. That's also a good sign. I think as well the promise of that shift between the stars mechanic, like if there's actually a bunch of mechanics that like, oh, maybe we solve this one by shifting the person between the stars, maybe we solve it by doing a healer cooldown, maybe we solve it with
that's
defensives,
awesome, exactly,
right? Like that's so cool.
And
like,
everything,
if there's, like, 4 mechanics
all
in
the
a
numbers
30-second window,
all the numbers in the fight suggest that you could, if you wanted to, deal with any single one of them. But like, so like it is an option where like, okay, someone going down between the stars here actually doesn't make sense because of this. Oh, we're going to heal through one bomb going off, or we're going to deal with one knockback, or we're going to have a tank explosion with all their CDs or whatever, right? Like you have multiple ways to play. And I think it won't even be something where people just copy what first people do. I think there will actually be unique solutions to a lot of different times of this boss. As you get more and more gear, there will be different things that are difficult as usual with end bosses. So like that kind of decision making actually becomes pretty significant over time. I agree with you. I think this boss's potential is top 5 end boss of all time. It has all the bones of it.
Yeah, this has been an optimistic tier list so far, right? Whenever there's been a benefit of the doubt, we've kind of given it whenever we think it's more likely than not, or reasonable at least. So I'd say throw this thing in DDDDD, and if we're wrong, we're wrong. But
yeah, if we're wrong, we're wrong. You hope it's there. Obviously, tuning is such a big part of this. So like, you can, but this is not, we can't guess on tuning. That is something we have no control over. All we can do is judge it based on the design. I think the design of the last boss is an absolute fucking heater. And the one thing I'm pretty confident of is that it is going to be a shorter end boss. And I'll just go with history. And every short end boss has fucking owned. They're objectively maybe 1 and 2, but certainly both top 5, probably in most people's list top 3 for bosses if you did both of them. So big fan. I agree with this. I also think that Rashok and Zskarn have a higher chance of being better for their spot in the raid. So I would probably put Sarkareth at the end of DDD, but it doesn't really matter. Okay, so what people will notice is, and based on design, this raid is looking far. I wonder if I could actually pull up the tier list. I know I made a YouTube video about it where we ranked the Vault bosses. I wonder if I could actually just search for Vault of the Incarnates here and see if... Okay, here it is. Okay, so this is what we ranked the mythic versions of Vault of the Incarnates on a previous tier list, which has no DDDD bosses, Taros in S, Broodkeeper and Aranog in A, Kurog and Primal Council in B, Senarth in C, Razageth and Dathia in Swamp. So obviously execution is different from theory and design. For example, Kurog's design was like top tier, but it was a failure, but still fine. This is again mythic. Like Razageth is one of the best heroic bosses ever, but on mythic just has massive problems, has multiple intermissions that had no reason existing, and obviously any boss where the last 30% is irrelevant and you get there and it instantly dies is a really unsatisfying end boss situation. But you're seeing that the design here is trending really high. I wish we would have done a design going into Vault of the Incarnates. That would have been really interesting to kind of look back on and see how the execution landed. That's something we can probably do in the future, but
yeah, and we gotta use this when we come back in a couple months' time and look at these bosses once we've actually done them.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is the most likely thing to be massively different than its ranking that we just did? Like, what's the most likely thing to fall off? It's not Zaqali Assault.
I think it's Zskarn. I think Zskarn has a good chance of being a stinker. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think it's likely, but I think it is the one that's most likely to be farthest away from its position in this list.
Yep, I think I'd agree with that. Like, Kazzara, how bad could fucking Kazzara be? Like,
right, exactly. Like,
Amalgamation Chamber...
Even if it is, they'll fix it in a day, right? Like,
exactly.
that boss can't... The way it can be bad is it's, like, brutally difficult, and that will get fixed.
I also think Magmorax could definitely be insane. Like, Magmorax could 100% hit DDD, especially because it seems like it's constantly getting iterated on, so even the version it is now could be not as good as progression. Very Halandrous-y. Oh, also, I think Echo Neltharion could... Echo Neltharion... seriously has the potential to be at the highest. These are like 4 or 5 bosses where, like, if you look back at the last raid, like, you had probably very few bosses that could potentially be that great. So very optimistic. All right, hell yeah. I appreciated the time you spent. I fucking love doing shit like this. So I'm glad you're one of the few people probably in the WoW community that is not in a top, like a super like going for World First Guild and actually spends a ton of time really wanting to learn and engage with a lot of the fights. And they're like, you care about fight design, which is cool. Not a lot of people do that.
Yeah, this is my favorite like part of the learning the fights, learning how they work. It's a joy. So can't wait to see what you guys have planned for how to handle with some of these bosses as well.
Oh yeah. This was one of the more, and it's probably because the fight design was so good. This was one of the most fun testing cycles. Just multiple mythic tests were like, holy fuck, this game owns. Just that kind of feeling. Like you leave the test and you're like, god damn, sometimes this game is so good. And that happened multiple times.
Yeah, let's
go.
Exactly.
Like, let's fucking go. Yeah. All right. All right. I'm heading out. Thanks, man.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
See ya.